Kia ora. I've titled my sermon today, The Ongoing Tragedy of Gaza and Israel. There was a type of cynicism that came with my New Zealand high school education. We would stand back from certain issues, laugh at the greed and lust for power that undergirded much foreign policy, and shake our heads in self-righteous dismay at the persistent violence and corruption in our world. The Israel Palestine conflict was one such issue. Time and again, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth approach of both sides resulted in mutual blindness and bloodied mouths. We, with our teenage insight and arrogance, knew this violent interchange wouldn't produce peace, and nothing short of a miracle would. Such teenage cynicism often transmutes into adult feelings of indifference and despondency. In those high school years, I was also exposed to a form of Christianity that extolled the wonders of the birth of the nation of Israel and how it was allegedly part of God's master plan. This was blended with lashings of fiction imagined to be fact by the likes of Leon Uris and other novelists. It was easy to empathize with the hardy Jews who had survived the Nazis by sheer grit and determination, and fashioned a future in the so-called desolate wasteland that was once ancient Israel. Of course, that desolate wasteland was somebody else's home. Canaanite, Hittite, and Philistine peoples, Palestine being a derivative from Philistia, once lived there. The independent entity called the Kingdom of Israel, founded by Saul, lasted for less than 100 years as an united kingdom. That was from 1050 to 920 BCE, before splitting into two, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. 200 years later, 722, the Israelite independence was ended by the Assyrians, and the population dispersed and exiled. Judah suffered a similar fate under the Babylonians 2 centuries later with the conquest of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Even when Cyrus, the Persian king, allowed Jews to return to Jerusalem in 537, only a few, such as Nehemiah and Ezra, chose to return. Following the exile, the so-called Promised Land was occupied by successive foreign powers: Babylonia, Achaemenid Persia, the Seleucids, Rome, the Byzantines, the Arabs, and then successive Islamic kingdoms down to the Turkish Ottomans. Except for just 2 centuries of European Christian rule, namely the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem from 1099 to 1291. From 638 CE until 1919, the region today called the State of Israel was ruled by successive Muslim rulers and kingdoms. During the First World War, Palestine was occupied by British forces and became part of the Mandate under the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 that carved up the Near East between the French and British. During the period of Muslim governance, Jews and Christians were allowed freedom to practice their faith as people of the book. During this period, the notion of a Jewish homeland or state was an aspirational vision amongst some exiled Jews linked to the coming of the Messiah. A Jewish state, however, was not something that was part of Christian European policy. Jews in Europe were heavily discriminated against, far more than in Muslim states. Christian views on a Jewish homeland only rose to prominence during the early 19th century, under the influence of a millenarian movement led by Dutch and British evangelicals, who believed that prior to Christ's physical return to earth, all Jews had to become Christians. As part of this process, they also had to have their own state with Jerusalem as its capital. This is the same ideology that Brian Tamaki's followers and many of Donald Trump's base have been influenced by. Sometimes it's called Christian Zionism. Of course, the complexities of the current conflict in Israel Palestine are rooted in religion as well as race. Jews have been treated with fear and suspicion and unbelievable oppression, most notably the Holocaust. Furthermore, Jesus was a Jew, as were all of his early followers. He lived in Palestine and died in Jerusalem. And in that land today there are holy places sacred to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And the church has persecuted Jews for most of the church's history, laying the ground for the Holocaust and creating the circumstances that made the creation of the State of Israel necessary. Meanwhile, there have been Christians living in Israel Palestine continuously since the first century. And those Christians, like everyone else whose ancestors lived in the land, are Palestinians. In political terms, the notion of a homeland for European Jews was only formally recognized by a major European power in 1917 with the British Balfour Declaration. Even so, this declaration stated that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The origin of the current conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is rooted not so much in Palestinian demands for a state, but in the dispossession of Palestinians, both Muslim and Christian, from their land. Prior to 1948, Palestinians were the lawful owners and occupiers of land within the agreed frontiers of the State of Israel, as defined by the UN's 1947 declaration. These Palestinians held land tenure documents issued by the Ottomans, and many of them had owned lands there for generations. In spite of this, many Palestinians were forcibly driven from their lands and houses, notably during the 1948 Nakba disaster. Radical Jewish groups such as the Stern Gang and Irgun forcibly extended Jewish frontiers in violation of the UN agreement and dispossessed Palestinians of their lands and goods. Later, some Zionists propagated the myth that all these Palestinians voluntarily abandoned their lands. Today, the process of dispossession of Palestinian lands continues in violation of many UN agreements. The erection and extension of Jewish settlements on Palestinian land in the West Bank and the construction of the so-called security fence are but two examples. And of course, there is now Gaza. In response to the killing of 1,200 people, primarily Israeli citizens, on October the 7th, 2023, by Hamas militants from Gaza, Israel declared itself in a state of war, and have since killed in response more than 58,400 Palestinian citizens, 80% of whom are civilians, and 1,400 are healthcare workers. Furthermore, many Palestinians in Gaza are now following food blockades by the Israeli government, suffering from malnutrition and starving. This is why a number of international groups, including the UN and Amnesty International, are calling this a genocide. Unlike other invasions of Gaza by Israeli forces, this conflict has moved far beyond any rational assessment of retributive justice or disabling potential military threats. It seems for the far right-wing coalition that Netanyahu, that's Israel's prime minister, this coalition he's driving, it seems for them that security for Israel will only come if the people of Gaza are starved, killed, or displaced. Indeed, many politicians have made such statements in the Israeli parliament. In short, unfolding before the eyes of the world, we're witnessing a deliberate, planned, and executed genocide. As Amnesty's report said, whether in parallel with or as a means to achieve its military goal of destroying Hamas, Israel's intent is the physical destruction of Palestinians in Gaza. As a 20-year-old, I went and lived in Israel. I stayed and worked at a kibbutz on the Israel-Lebanon border. It was in the months before an invasion of Lebanon. Even then, there were rockets being fired into Israel on a number of evenings. There was no loss of life from these rockets in the time I was there. And then on the mornings after, Israeli F-15 fighters, supplied by Americans, flew over the border and bombed Lebanese villages where the so-called terrorists were said to reside. There were many fatalities, mostly civilian. Yet my abiding memory of that time wasn't the rockets, but the attitudes of the kibbutzniks among whom I worked. On the one hand, they were the backbone of the army in those days. On the other, they were solidly labor voters and saw the wisdom in trading land for peace. However, it was the pervasive and blatant racism that shocked me the most. I remember once, for example, returning from the fields at lunchtime, having heard that a young child had drowned at the nearby beach, and sharing the mutual concern of the small rural community for the child's family. A community leader, however, stood up and announced in the dining room that no one should worry, for it was only an Arab. The other thing I discovered while in Israel was the strength of the national peace movement. There are many Israelis, let alone other Jews around the world, who were opposed to the strategies and goals of militant Zionism. Organizations like a Jewish Voice for Peace and Union for Reformed Judaism. Abigail Alon, an Israeli living in New Zealand, wrote about the Gaza conflict, saying, "Many Jews desperately want freedom for Palestinians. Many of us desire to live alongside our brothers and sisters in peace. Many of us want to right the wrongs done to them. It's the right thing to do. It's the Jewish thing to do. And it's the only thing that will guarantee our people a future in the land between the river and the sea. There's no symmetry of power in Palestine. Israel has the upper hand. The responsibility lies with the Israeli government to shape the security situation in the region. And in their response to the Hamas attack, I feel they have betrayed us. Slaughtering Gazans by the thousands is not a legitimate response. It is not politics, but an absence of politics. It is barbaric, genocidal violence. They have abandoned peace and doomed us all, Palestinians and Israelis, to unending death and despair. If we really love that land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, we have to find a different way. As the history of Israel has shown since 1948, the so-called problem of the Palestinian dispossession and resistance cannot be solved by force. Despite the deployment of the overwhelming firepower of the Israeli military, the rockets will, given time, continue to be fired into Israeli territory. Each new military incursion merely provides a new generation of militants, as people seek some retribution for the deaths of family members and the devastation of their homes and livelihoods. The triumvirate of fear, hate, and violence does not create well-being, peace, and security. Rather, it replicates itself. Those who have the greater power have the greater responsibility to desist from warfare and initiate peace. Peace requires one to invest in the well-being of one's enemy. Quite counterintuitive. So, what needs to happen for the sake of peace? The simple version is firstly to stop killing and destroying, and then work towards what is the greatest good for all who live in that land. That will involve, on the one hand, Jews being able to live without fear of massacre or subtler forms of oppression and threat. The world has to understand that October the 7th, 2023, embodied the worst fear of Jews, and recognize the trauma of that day as littered with landmines, many reasoned paths to peace. On the other hand, Palestinian aspirations to dignity, respect, humanity, and life itself continue. It's hard to imagine any peace emerging that does not involve Palestinians having an identity and security and economy that comes through an independent geographical state. Better ideas might exist, but they have yet to appear in 77 years of imagining. Unless progress is made on this agenda, there will be no soil in which moderate Palestinian leadership can grow. And Palestinian authorities will be at the mercy of foreign backers who may not have their best interests at heart. As I've grown older, I realize that one of the spiritual disciplines needed in our time is the ability to counter cynicism. It's not hard to shield yourself with indifference and to keep despondency at bay, to look the other way about these events that happen overseas, that murder innocents and seem impossible to solve. This cynicism can reach almost epidemic proportions in a country like ours, far, far away at the bottom of the world. To stand up and express our opposition to killing, to believe that peace may one day be possible, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, to align ourselves with people of wisdom and courage, whose only counter to cynicism is to live life of prayer, hope, and action. This is what I now believe.